The day they married her off to the dying king, nobody brought flowers, not one arrangement, not a single petal. The great hall of Vaelthorn smelled like cold stone and candle smoke, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone present knows something shameful is happening and nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud. Seraphine Ashveil stood at the end of the ceremonial aisle in a dress that was not hers, borrowed from the royal wardrobe, white, slightly too long at the hem, clearly designed for a woman with different proportions and a different life. And she thought, well, here we are. The 5 Lords of Vaelthorn sat in the gallery above, watching with the specific expressions of men who have solved a problem they are mildly embarrassed to have needed to solve. She was the problem. She had been the problem for 5 years, since the night of her presentation ceremony when the royal physicians had pressed their instruments to her wrist and announced, in front of 60 witnesses and 1 mortified mother, that she produced no scent. None. 0. The instruments read blank. In Vaelthorn, an omega who produces no scent is called Scentless. There is a longer term in the old texts, something clinical, something with 4 syllables, but nobody uses it. Scentless is what they say. Scentless is what they write in the ledgers. Scentless is the word her younger sisters stopped using around her because they had noticed, at some point, that it made her go very still in a way that was uncomfortable to watch. She had been 22 years old for 4 months. She had done nothing wrong. She had studied medicine and governance and 3 dead languages, while her family's finances collapsed around her like a building that had decided, incrementally, to stop being a building. She had catalogued the Ashveil library down to its last marginalia, reorganized the medical wing twice, and managed, by the precise application of skill and complete personal invisibility, to make herself genuinely useful in a household that had otherwise given up on her. And then the summons came. She was cross-referencing 2 contradictory accounts of the vein fever when the junior official appeared in the doorway and cleared his throat 3 times before she looked up. He held the royal seal. His hands were doing something complicated, not quite shaking, but aware of the possibility. She read the decree, set it down, picked up her pen, finished her notes. Then she folded the decree into her medical satchel, walked upstairs, and packed 1 bag. Her mother found her on the landing. "Sarah, the rosemary tincture is on the 3rd shelf," Seraphine said. "It needs to be restocked by the end of the month. I've left instructions with the apothecary. You don't have to go." She looked at her mother, kindly, completely, the look of someone who knows exactly what is true and has decided not to make anyone else carry it. "Yes, I do," she said. She walked out. The morning was cold. The road to the capital was 40 minutes by carriage, and she spent those 40 minutes memorizing everything she could remember about the vein sickness, which was considerable, because she had been reading about it for 3 years, because it was interesting, because Seraphine Ashveil had the specific and somewhat inconvenient characteristic of finding everything interesting, even things that were killing people, even things that might be about to kill her. The king's wing smelled wrong. She noticed it immediately, that particular wrong smell that sick rooms develop when the wrong remedies have been applied for too long. Oversweet, heavy with something floral and pharmaceutical trying to smother something beneath it that would not be smothered. She walked down the corridor with her bag over one shoulder, and her notes folded in her coat pocket, and a face that said absolutely nothing to anyone she passed, which was easy, because nobody looked at her, which was easy, because in Vaelthorn, nobody looked at scentless omegas in borrowed dresses, unless they had a specific use for them. The door to the king's chambers was twice her height. The hinges were old iron and made a sound like a question being asked in the wrong language. She went in. He was in the bed, or rather, he occupied the bed the way weather occupies a landscape, as something that was there before the room was built around it, and would be there after. Enormous. Even lying propped against the carved headboards with the gray color of illness over his face, he was built like something that had been constructed deliberately, with intention, out of specifically selected materials. His eyes were open and dark, and they found her immediately, and the expression in them was the expression of a man who has been brought disappointing news so many times that he has simply made peace with the concept of disappointing news in general. He looked at her the way men look at a closed door. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The candles were wrong. Too many, positioned too close to the bed. She filed this away. "You're the scentless one," he said. His voice was gravel under water. Even sick, it filled the room. "Yes," she said. "You know I'm dying." "I know that's the current medical assessment," she said. "I've read it. I find it somewhat optimistic about how much the physicians actually understand." A pause. His eyes moved over her with that particular measuring quality that told her this was not a man who processed information slowly. He was assessing. She was used to being assessed. She stood still for it. "You didn't bring flowers," he said. "You're not a funeral yet." The silence afterward was not hostile. It was something else. The particular quality of silence that happens when two people have both said something true and are taking a moment to acknowledge the fact. "Sit," he said. She sat. She put her bag on the floor. She pulled out her notes. "What are those?" he said. Not a question. A statement holding the shape of one. "Everything the royal physicians are doing wrong," she said. "Which is most things. Are you going to be difficult about this, or can we begin?" He looked at her for another long moment. "Begin," he said. She fired 2 physicians on the 3rd day. The first one tried to argue. She handed him a copy of the counter-evidence in writing, thanked him for his time, and stood beside the door until he left. The second one didn't argue. He looked at her notes, looked at her face, and had the particular intelligence to realize that whatever she was not the thing he had assumed she was when she walked in, and that this might be a good moment to reconsider his position entirely. He left quietly. Cale said nothing about this. What he said instead was, "The window." She had found him that morning sitting slightly upright against the pillows with his face turned toward the window, which was, at that point, latched shut. The curtains were heavy. The room was airless. "The window wants to be open," she said. "Yes." She opened it. Cold morning air came through like it had been waiting. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Not in relief, she noted, but in the specific controlled way of someone allowing themselves one very small thing. She watched this without comment. She began reorganizing his dietary regimen in her notebook. The weeks developed their own rhythm. She came in the mornings. She reorganized, observed, adjusted. She sat with him in the evenings when the fever spiked, which it did, reliably, between the 8th and 11th hour, and read aloud from governance texts because she had run out of medical ones, and the silence at that specific hour was different from silence at other hours. Heavier somehow, with more texture, and she had found, by accident, that her reading made it lighter. He never asked her to continue. He also never asked her to stop. On the 17th day, she noticed that the window was already unlatched when she arrived. For the light, she assumed. She didn't mention it. Lord Kalen arrived on a Tuesday, because bad things often did. He was a beta lord with a long neck and longer opinions, and the specific manner of a man who had confused the habit of speaking directly with the permission to say whatever occurred to him. He came to assess the king's condition, to determine, as the official brief put it, whether the crown is currently functional for purposes of governance. Which was a careful way of saying, is Kale still worth anything, or do we begin the succession? He came with 3 attendants and a permanent expression of mild contempt that he wore the way other men wear cologne, applied in the morning, assumed to be universally appropriate. Seraphine served the tea. This was not her function. She had no function as staff. She was technically the king's wife, in the technical sense that a document existed and a ceremony had occurred. But Kalen had looked through her when he entered, in the practiced way of a man who had categorized her on sight and found the category uninteresting, and she had decided, in the moment, that being invisible was useful. She listened. Kalen spoke to Kale the way a man speaks to a building he intends to sell, with the slightly performative warmth of someone who needs the building to not collapse before the paperwork is done. He said the court was concerned. He said certain parties were asking questions. He said that the arrangement, Here a gesture toward Seraphine at the side table was an understandable stopgap, clean and economical, no risk of inconvenient bonding, defect used as function. That sort of practical thinking, not without its elegance really. He used the word defect, the way some men say it, without emphasis, without apology, as pure description. She poured the tea. She had, while pouring, added something. Not harmful, completely harmless in fact. A combination of herbs whose only distinguishing characteristic was that, when metabolized, they produced a scent response in the person who had consumed them that read, to any alpha within 12 meters, as the fullest possible biological presentation signal. The equivalent, in scent language, of standing in the middle of a room screaming. She handed Lord Kalen his cup. He drank it. Kale watched her from across the room. His expression was exactly the same as it always was, which was to say it was unreadable, which was to say she had learned in 3 weeks that unreadable was doing a significant amount of work. Kalen left 20 minutes later. His 3 attendants were already walking very quickly ahead of him. The 2 Alpha guards stationed in the corridor outside had rotated to face the opposite wall. The situation would correct itself in approximately 6 hours. Seraphine cleared the cups. That was unnecessary, Kale said. Probably, she agreed. A pause. He'll come back, Kale said. I know. It won't be as effective the second time. I know. I'll think of something else. The silence was different this time. Not the measured silence of a sick man tolerating a caretaker. Something with attention in it. Something that was looking at her rather than past her. What do you want? He said. The question was so direct and so unexpected that she looked up from the tray. He was watching her with the focused quality he usually reserved for the political documents she had. At some point, started leaving at his bedside because he had been bored, and boredom in a king is a specific kind of suffering. I want to do my work, she said, without interruption. That's not what you want. She looked at him, went still. The stillness was armor. She knew it was armor. She was relatively certain he knew it too, and was filing the knowledge away with the particular patience of a man who was not going to do anything with it yet. No, she said, finally. It isn't. She didn't say what was. He didn't press. She picked up the tray and walked out and stood in the corridor for 30 seconds before she started walking again. She found the curse on a Thursday, which seemed like the wrong day for it. She had been cross-referencing 3 texts, 2 medical histories and 1 social record from the previous century, looking for a pattern in the symptom progression. The royal physicians had been treating the illness as a variant of the vein fever, which was a hereditary condition and well documented. The documentation was, in her assessment, incomplete. She found the reference in a margin note, in a record from 212 years ago, in handwriting so small and compressed that whoever wrote it had clearly not wanted it to be found. The vein binding, activated by proximity of the countermark, dormant in the carrier, presents in the bonded bloodline as progressive wasting, reversible on full resonance. See addendum, classification, primordial. She read it twice. She turned to the addendum. She read that 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time without seeing it. A primordial omega. The classification had been in the texts. She had read references to it, had always understood it as historical, as extinct, as the kind of category that existed in old records the same way dragons did. Possible, theoretically, once, in some earlier and wilder version of the world. Primordial omegas did not produce scent because they produced something categorically different, a resonance, a biological signal so old that the modern measurement instruments were not designed to detect it. The royal physicians had pressed their instruments to her wrist and read 0, and the instruments had been correct. 0 scent. They had simply been reading the wrong thing entirely. The resonance. She turned to her left wrist, which she had looked at every day of her adult life with the particular tiredness of looking at something that is supposed to mean something and has only ever meant failure. The mark was there. It had always been there. A small silvered pattern that she had been told, growing up, was a common variation in omega presentation marks. Nothing unusual, nothing to read into. She pulled the record closer. The illustration was old and faded, but the shape was unmistakable. She sat with this information for a long time, 3 days specifically. During those 3 days she was precise and quiet and present, and did her work with her usual exactness, and met every question and conversation with her usual steadiness and focused, when conversations required eye contact, on a spot approximately 6 inches past whoever was speaking. She did not tell Kale. She told no one. She needed to understand first what it meant. She needed to understand second what she was going to do with it. Because information like this was a specific kind of weight, the kind that changes shape depending on how you hold it, and she needed to know how she was going to hold it before she let anyone else see she was carrying it. She went home one afternoon, told her mother the rosemary needed restocking again, walked down to the Ashveil library, and read everything that had ever been written about primordial omegas in 4 languages until the candles burned down. Then she walked back to the capital. She was not afraid. She was something else. Something without a clean name. Something that sat in the chest like a door that has been standing closed for a very long time and has just been told it is allowed to open. He was getting better. The court noticed it in stages, the way you notice the weather changing. First a detail that could be coincidence, then a pattern that is harder to dismiss, then a fact that requires accounting for. His color had returned. His strength was coming back in increments that the royal physicians were documenting with the particular enthusiasm of people taking credit for someone else's work. He was sleeping better, eating, engaging with state documents with the sharp and somewhat exhausting focus that his advisors had apparently been dreading as much as missing. The court began talking about heirs. This was, in the nature of courts, inevitable. The king was recovering. The king was 34 years old. The king had no children and no named heir, and a political situation that required the impression of dynastic continuity. The fact that he was technically married to a scentless omega of no consequence was a complication, but complications had a way of being resolved. 3 noble daughters were presented at a formal dinner. Seraphine attended as staff. This was also inevitable. She had no official title in the king's household. That too had been left to be resolved. She sat at the serving table and plated food and refilled wine and kept her face at exactly the expression she had been keeping it at since she was 17. Present, useful, nowhere in particular. The first daughter was formal and accomplished. The second was well-connected and careful. The third was warm in a way that seemed unconstructed, warm the way sunlight is warm, without effort or agenda, laughing at something the man beside her said, and then looking slightly surprised at her own laugh. She smelled like summer rain, which was a thing Seraphine knew because she couldn't smell anyone the way alphas did, but the resonance she carried read warmth and ease, and that was close enough. Kale spoke with all 3 of them. He was measured. He was polite. He was the king, which meant that every word he said was the kind of word that could be repeated in a governance room and mean something. He did not look at the serving table. Seraphine left the dinner early. She told no one. She walked back to her room in the east wing, the room that had been assigned to her because it was available and small and far from anything important, and she sat on the floor with her back against the bed and read, not medical texts, the governance records she had been working through. She read until the feeling that was happening somewhere in her chest did whatever feelings do when you give them enough time and enough words to hide under. She was fine. She was always fine. This was the most honest thing about her, and also, she suspected, the thing that was doing her the most consistent damage. He had known for longer than she thought. Kale Vane had survived 4 attempts on his life before his 21st birthday, which had produced in him a specific and permanent habit of reading rooms before he entered them, and people before he trusted them, and information before he accepted it. He had looked at the pattern of her research from the beginning, noting which texts she requested, which records she cross-referenced, where her attention snagged. He had his own copies of several of the records she had been working through. He had access to things she did not, including 3 sealed royal documents that had been classified 2 centuries ago and not opened since. He had opened them on the night of the 14th day. He had read the word primordial and gone very still. He had sat with it the way Seraphine sat with things. not processing through it, but letting it settle, turning it over in his hands until he understood not just what it was, but what it meant and what it required. She had the countermark. She had been healing him, not through any deliberate action, not through a choice she had made or a power she had chosen to exercise. She had been sitting beside him in the dark, reading governance texts about water rights and regional tax structures, and her presence had been doing something to the curse that no physician, no herbalist, no specialist in a dozen cities had been able to touch. She had known this for approximately 3 days, based on the change in her attention in those 3 days, which was the specific change that happens in a person who is carrying something they have not yet decided how to carry. She hadn't told him. She hadn't leveraged it, hadn't negotiated with it, hadn't used the knowledge to reposition herself in a court that had dismissed her, to claim the title that was technically already hers, to extract anything at all from a situation that had given her nothing but a borrowed dress and a room in the East Wing. He sat in his chair by the window, which was open, which was always open now, and he thought about this. He had met, in his life, many people who had possessed some advantage over him and had used it. This was understandable. This was, in his experience, what people did. Power was used. Leverage was applied. Survival required the willingness to use whatever you had. She had sat beside him and read about water rights. He did not know what to do with a person like that. He had no framework for it, no prior experience that mapped onto it. He was a king who had built his entire understanding of human motivation around the reliable predictability of self-interest, and she was quietly and completely collapsing that understanding by simply existing in the East Wing and not doing anything about it. He realized, with the particular discomfort of a man who rarely admits to being anything, undone by it. He called for her the following evening. The room was empty when she came in. No physicians, no attendants, no junior officials with their careful expressions. Just the candles, which were now positioned correctly because she had repositioned them 3 weeks ago, and the open window, and the king in the chair. She read the room in 3 seconds. Sat without being asked. "You know what you are," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "You've known for days." "Yes." "You didn't tell me." She looked at him steadily. "I needed to understand it first. And now you do. Mostly." He was quiet for a moment. She waited. She was good at waiting, had spent most of her life becoming good at it by necessity, which was not the same as choosing it, but had produced the same result. "You didn't use it," he said. "Use it for what?" The question sat in the room and expanded. He looked at her, really looked, with the full attention that he usually kept behind a layer of strategic opacity, and said nothing for a long time. She waited. "I'm not dying," he said. "No. Because of you. Because of proximity. It's a biological mechanism. I didn't choose it." She paused. "I chose to stay." The last sentence arrived, and then sat there. She had not planned to say it. It was simply true, and had come out in the way that true things sometimes do when you are tired, and the room is quiet, and the person across from you is looking at you like they are finally seeing the thing they have been looking at all along. Cale reached across the space between the chair and the small side table where she sat. He took her wrist, the left one, the marked one. He held it in the specific, careful way of a man who has just understood that something is not what he was told it was, and is angry at himself for having been told wrong and for having believed it. She went still, not the armor kind, the other kind, the kind that happens under the armor when you put it down. Neither of them said anything. The candles moved in the air from the window. The Lords moved on a Friday. It had a rhythm to it, the way they did it, the rhythm of men who have had this specific conversation before, who have a script for this specific situation, who have agreed privately on what the script requires and are now performing it for each other to make it official. Emergency council, emergency agenda. The primordial classification had been found in the sealed documents. They had their own researchers, their own access, their own reasons for digging. The countermark had been identified. The asset had been assessed. The word they used was asset. The action they proposed was reclassification. From wife of the king, which was a status with implications, to medical resource of the crown, which was a status without them. Containment. Study. The king was recovering and no longer required the proximity. The asset could be useful in other applications. There were other bloodline conditions in the noble families. There were experiments that had been attempted before the primordial classification was sealed and archived and declared extinct. They voted. They did not invite Kale. This was the mistake that the histories would record as the mistake, later, when people wrote about it. Not because he would not have been outvoted, he might have been, but because the decision to act without him was a statement about what they believed he still was, and what they believed he still was diminished, sick, manageable. He was none of those things. He had not been those things for some time. A junior official told Seraphine. He came to the East Wing at mid-morning with the official documentation folded in his hands and the expression of a man who has drawn the short straw. He could not look her in the eye. He told her the decision. He told her the timeline. He told her that arrangements would be made and that her cooperation was appreciated. He said appreciated. She thanked him. She sat on the floor of her room. The floor was stone and cold, and she sat on it anyway, back against the bed, the way she always sat when she needed to think, without the feeling of things above her, ceilings, expectations, the accumulated weight of rooms designed by and for people who had already decided what she was. Well, here we are. She thought about it for a long time. The calculation was not complex. They had found the record. They knew what she was. They had decided what to do with what she was, without consulting her, which was entirely consistent with every decision that had ever been made about her life and her body and her function, which had never once included her input, which had always been made by people with the power to make it, and the confidence to assume that power was the same thing as the right. The anger came then. She recognized it. Old acquaintance. The sweet, familiar thing that steadied her when the other thing, the thing without a name, the thing in the chest, the thing that knew what it felt but refused to call it by any word, got too large to hold. She let the anger do its work. And then, underneath it, something else. Something that had been waiting, she realized, for 22 years, since the night the instruments read 0 and the physicians announced it, and 60 witnesses watched her mother's face understand what it meant, and she had stood there, 17 years old, and gone very still, not defective, not empty, reading the wrong frequency entirely. She closed her eyes. She had been suppressing the resonance her whole life, not intentionally. You cannot intentionally suppress something you do not know you have, but the body learns. The body develops strategies. When you grow up being told that the thing you produce is nothing, is absence, is a blank space where a self should be, the body takes that information and applies it inward, turns the signal down, not off but down, sustainable, manageable, nothing that will alarm anyone. She had been turned down for 22 years. She turned up, not anger, not strategy, something much quieter and much more fundamental. The simple and irreversible decision to stop performing smallness for the comfort of people who required her to be small to feel safe. The resonance expanded. It moved the way sound moves, not in waves but in presence, through the stone of the walls, through the floors, through the vast old architecture of Vaelthorn's royal wing with its accumulated centuries of power and hierarchy and careful classification. It hit the vein curse the way a key hits a lock. Not the piece of it that had been working on Kale, that had been working for weeks, the incremental dismantling that happened in proximity, the slow deconstruction of one man's binding. This was the full version. The clause that nobody had finished reading in 2 centuries because the record had been sealed before anyone reached the addendum, the vein binding applied to the bloodline. The countermark, at full resonance, deactivated it for the bloodline, the entire bloodline. Kale's younger brother, who had been bedridden in the Eastern Estate for 11 years, with the slow wasting that everyone had called a different name because nobody had connected it to the same source. He would feel it first. The specific sensation of something that has been tight in the chest for so long, you had forgotten what it felt like before it was tight, releasing. Kale's heir apparent, 11 years old, installed in the castle nursery with a permanent physician and the specific gravity of a child who has been sick long enough to develop the emotional vocabulary of someone twice his age, the color coming back into his face, and every other minor scion of the Vain bloodline scattered across the kingdom, who had been quietly, individually, unconnectedly presenting with variants of the same condition that nobody had assembled into a pattern, because nobody had the record, because the record was sealed, because someone 2 centuries ago had decided it was better to seal it than to let the world know what a primordial Omega could do. This was what it could do. In the east wing, Seraphine sat on the cold floor with her back against the bed and her left wrist in her own right hand, and felt the resonance move through the building, and she did not perform anything. She did not produce an expression. She sat with it the way you sit with very large things, without trying to make them smaller. There was a specific clause in the ancient bonding law. She had found it in the same record as the countermark illustration, in the same cramped marginal handwriting that she was beginning to think had been written by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and had buried it where someone would only find it if they already knew to look. A being who enacts the full resonance of the primordial function, dissolving a bloodline binding incomplete, is by the law of original compact, not property of the crown. Such a being is by the law of original compact of the crown, not a ward, not a resource, not an asset, of the crown. She read it 3 times. She looked up at the ceiling. She did not smile. She was not a person who smiled at ceilings. But something shifted in the quality of her stillness. The stillness became less about holding something in and more about standing in something that had finally arrived. Kale was in the council chamber in 14 minutes. He had felt it, not the resonance itself, which was not something an alpha could perceive directly, but the effect of it, the specific physical sensation of a pressure he had been living with for so long that he had classified it as his baseline, his normal, the weight of being himself, releasing, along with, presumably, the sound of a physician sprinting down the corridor from the nursery wing. The 5 lords were still in session. He entered the way a man enters a room when he has decided that the performance of patience is finished, not loudly, not with visible anger, with the specific quality of stillness that is louder than either. He looked at them. They looked at him. He said her name, not the scentless one, not the asset, not the Omega, or the wife, or the resource, or any other word that the language of Vaelthorn provided for classifying women who inconvenienced the people around them by refusing to be what they were told they were. Seraphine. Seraphine Ashveil. 2 words. Her words. The ones that belonged to her. She stays, he said. Quiet. Absolute. In the tone of a man who has decided to be done with a particular kind of conversation permanently. Adjust your understanding accordingly. He left. The histories would record what followed in administrative language. The reclassification, the reinstatement of the primordial Omega designation in the official texts, the legal review of the ancient bonding compact, the formal acknowledgement of what had been done and what it meant, and who, under law, held what position. The histories were good at the administrative language. They were less good at the other part. The part that happened in a room in the royal wing, late, with the window open and the candles correctly positioned, and 2 people who had spent weeks learning to read each other's silences, sitting in the specific quiet of people who have a very large thing between them that has not yet been given a name. He asked her what she wanted. The same question, not the same question. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the candles moved twice in the air from the window. Long enough that the silence stopped being uncomfortable and became something else. The kind of silence that is present, that is attending, that is holding space for whatever arrives. To stay, she said. Not as a caretaker, she looked at him. Not as a caretaker. As what? She went still. But this stillness, this one was different. It was not armor, it was not performance. It was not the strategy of a woman who had spent 22 years learning to make herself small enough to survive rooms that were not built for her. It was the stillness that happens underneath all of that, beneath the armor and the precision and the governance texts at 3 in the morning, and the well, here we are, and the absolute refusal to name the things she was not allowed to feel. The stillness of someone who has finally, at great cost and considerable inconvenience to everyone involved, put the armor down. She didn't say the word. She was not going to say the word. She had not said the word in 22 years, and she was not starting in a moment this significant. But her hand, on the arm of the chair, turned over, opened, and he was already moving. In the morning, the window was open. The light came in, the way it had been coming in for weeks, thin and winter pale, and entirely indifferent to the question of what it was illuminating. The candles had burned down. The governance texts were stacked on the table where she had left them. The medical notes were in her bag, which was on the floor, which was where it always was. Seraphine sat in the chair by the window. She was reading. The text was 400 years old and concerning a very specific agricultural dispute in the southern provinces that had never been resolved to anyone's satisfaction. It was extremely dull. She had her pen out. She was making notes in the margin in her own cramped handwriting. Cale looked at her from across the room. She was not performing anything. She had a smear of ink on the left side of her jaw and had not noticed. The borrowed dress was long gone. She was wearing something that fit, practical, unremarkable. Her hair was doing whatever it wanted. She was completely absorbed in a 400-year-old agricultural dispute with the intensity of a person who has decided that everything is worth understanding and nothing is beneath attention, and she would not look up for another 7 minutes, and when she did, it would be to ask him something specific about the Eastern Provincial water rights that he would actually know the answer to, which would lead to an argument that was more interesting than any conversation he had had with any person in recent memory. He knew all of this because he had been watching her for 3 months and had learned to read the shape of her attention the way sailors read weather. She looked up. "The 1642 Delvane Agreement," she said. "It was never ratified. I think it's still technically binding." "It isn't." "It might be." "It was voided in 1689. She looked at him with the expression she had when she suspected she had found something. "Show me." He got up. He crossed the room. He sat beside her. She handed him the text. He found the reference she needed and pointed to it, and she leaned forward to read it with the complete focus of someone who has entirely forgotten that there are categories for what they are supposed to be and who they are supposed to be, that to other people, and what that is supposed to look like. She read for a moment. She said. "I'm right," he said. "You're partially right." "That's right." She looked at him. He was very close. She had the specific expression of someone who is about to say something dry and devastating at low volume. "Well," she said, "here we are." He was silent for exactly the duration of a man deciding something. Then he said her name. Again, just her name. No title, no category. She went still. The good kind. Outside, the window was open. The morning came through. Somewhere in the eastern estate, a man who had been ill for 11 years was walking in the garden for the first time, his legs uncertain, his lungs full of cold air, his face turned toward the pale winter light with the specific expression of someone to whom ordinary things have stopped being ordinary. In the nursery wing, a child with new color in his cheeks was asking for breakfast. In the south study, 3 court scribes were bent over documents, reinstating a classification that had been declared extinct 2 centuries ago, and finding, with each page they turned, that it had simply been looking for the right person to carry it. And in the king's chambers, in the chair by the open window, Seraphine Ashveil, who had been declared defective at 17, who had packed 1 bag and said nothing useful to her mother, and sat with everything alone for 22 years, who had been handed a borrowed dress and a dying king and a room in the east wing, and had quietly, without announcement or credit, taken all of it apart and put it back together correctly, was reading, and was not, for the first time in a very long time, alone. The instruments had read 0. The instruments had been reading the wrong thing. She had not been empty. She had been frequency they had no tools to measure, and there is a significant difference between those 2 things, though it takes the right kind of attention to see it. Vaelthorn learned, in the years that followed, to use better instruments. It also learned to be more careful about what it declared extinct.